Hello and welcome to Unfurl. This is the third video and Shadow is here with me just to say hi. This is the video for between the new moons of May and June. So it's our final video and it's an amazing 3 months, isn't it? The amount of changes in the natural world from March till June is so huge, isn't it, Shads? Yeah, you love this time of year, don't you? So the first invitation is actually just to do the little pause of this video in your pack or in your journal. You can do some reflecting. And the invitation really at this point in the year is to think back to March, think back to that new moon. You can look at your notes and your journal from last time and the time before and just see how your unfurling is going. How are you feeling? How are things changing for you? It's also an opportunity to go back through your nature notes, isn't it? Yeah, and notice the epic changes that have happened in the natural world. I've also made for you a nature notes video. So there's one for March and there's one for May, and I went to the same woods twice and just compared the huge difference. So yeah, this is the first invitation to do a little pause and come back when you're ready and you've done a little bit of reflecting and tuning in and really dropping into the energy of the May moon. In this video, we're going to be meeting 2 new guides for the moon, and they're both pretty epic. It's a funny time of year because it's kind of hard to choose. There's so many plants and animals around. And what's interesting is how much mythology and power and magic there is with the guides that start to come up around this time of year. So I'm based in the south of England, and it's such a noticeable difference from March till June. And the plants and animal guides that I generally bring you are mostly from the European woodland, and that's very much true for today. So we're going to be working with bluebell and roe deer. And what's really exciting about both of those creatures is that they have been in the UK landscape for a really long time. So our ancestors would have been very familiar with them. And I think that's part of the reason why there is a lot of mythology tied up with them. So I'm going to be touching on that a bit more this moon, as well as the facts and all the other things as well. So I'm going to head straight into talking about the magnificent and beautiful bluebell. So this moon we are journeying with bluebell, one of the most beautiful woodland flowers and a favourite of the fairies. And it's interesting that they come up around Beltane, around May Day. They're very linked to how warm and cold and dry and wet it is. So when they'll burst into their most spectacular carpet of flower can vary a little bit. This year it's been a bit cooler, so they've come a bit later. But I think even if the bluebells have fully done their most spectacular display by this point, they're still really magical to tune into and send some gratitude to, because they're just such a beautiful flower. So we're talking particularly, I'm going to be talking about the English bluebell. They've been here in the UK since the last ice age, and bluebells in general are a Western European plant. They have been introduced, I think, to some places in North America where they've been a bit of a problem because they've become a bit invasive. And here we have a bit of a conflict between Spanish bluebells and English bluebells, and the tendency of the Spanish ones to be a bit more vigorous and they can take over. So I'm going to be talking mostly about English bluebells and their links to fairy tales and folklore, and just thinking, they would have been a plant that would have been very familiar to our ancestors. So there's a few different aspects that I wanted to cover about these beautiful flowers. We say they're blue, it's quite a hard colour to describe or capture, and even in photographs they can look slightly different to how they look in real life. I guess they're a sort of pale indigo. They're a bluey purple for me. And a carpet of bluebells in a woodland is a sign that it could be an ancient woodland. And that's a kind of particular describer of a type of woodland that we have here in England and Wales and Ireland and Scotland. And it means a wood that we know has been there since at least 1600 in England and Wales and 1750 in Scotland. And that's the point that the maps become reliable. So a wood might actually have been there for longer than that, but we've got the sort of data to say it was at least there then. And a lot of them are a lot older than that. So it's one of the signifiers, along with a couple of other species and things. There will be a little, almost like a tick list that a conservationist would go through to just say, yep. There's, there are these signs that this wood is ancient. And ancient woodlands are very special places. They only take up 2.5% of the land of the UK, and 70% of them have been lost or damaged already. But they are home to more species that are threatened with extinction than any other terrestrial habitat in the UK. So they're very precious and special. And there is some legal protection, but maybe not enough, that they can still be built on and developed and destroyed, as we are finding all too often. So as part of this magical, beautiful, ancient habitat, bluebells themselves have some legal protection around being picked or uprooted or destroyed. They're really sensitive to being trampled on. Their leaves stop being able to photosynthesize. So when we're visiting them, we need to be really cautious and careful. And I love the idea of the safe haven of an ancient woodland, and the bluebells being almost the carpet in this beautiful home that becomes a safe place for endangered creatures and for people. When we visit, they feel so special. There is something breathtaking about going to a wood full of bluebells. And it's of course about the sensory experience and the colour, and they smell beautiful. They've got this very subtle fragrance that's quite hard to capture or explain or describe. So you get this full sensory immersion experience. But I feel like we also feel in our bones the ancient safety of that kind of a place. They're as close to a wild, natural place as you're going to find here. In the UK, so many of our places, we don't really have something that's technically properly wild is very hard to find here. Everything has been managed or tampered with to some extent. So again, to me, that connection to the fairies feels like part of that. These are our wild places. This is where we haven't interfered too much, or we've been working with the trees and with the land when we have done things like coppicing and sort of traditional woodcraft practices. And I feel like that the fairies like that as much as the wildlife likes it too. So bluebells actually spend most of the year hiding in a little white bulb under the ground, and their bright green leaves are one of the first things to pop through the wintry leaf litter. The forest floor will tend to be very, very brown. They live in deciduous woodland, so the leaves fall down, they form this brown carpet, and one of the first things to push through will be the bright green leaves of the bluebells. And they flower from April into May, but as I said, that can vary a little bit. But they're one of the earliest flowers to bloom, and so that's why they're really important for pollinators. And quite often, if you're visiting some bluebells, you'll hear very loud buzzing of big chunky bumblebees, and it's one of the reasons that they're so magnificent and exciting is that they're one of the first bolts of colour that comes into a wintry woodland in spring. And they flower early to make the most of the sun before the trees get too many leaves. So once all the trees have got their leaves on them, they form the canopy and the forest floor will be quite shady. But the bluebells kind of pop up just before that happens. And I think that's another reason it's such a sensory feast to me. You'll get this carpet of blue and green, and the leaves that are coming in on the trees will be the first ones. So they are bright green, kind of lime green, and the colour contrast between those is just like, it's almost erotic. It's so beautiful. Quite often the bluebells near us really like beech trees, so there will be woods that are almost all beech, and their leaves are particularly this gorgeous bright green colour when they first come in, and it's just, yeah, it's hard to put into words how beautiful it is. So if you ever get a chance to visit a bluebell wood, I highly recommend it. It is, yeah, it's a juicy, sensual, gorgeous experience. Interestingly, one of the beautiful things about bluebells as well is that they can reproduce both via pollination and seeds, so via sexual reproduction, and asexual reproduction. Voila, tongue twister. So they almost can clone themselves and naturalise and spread over an area with the bulbs copying themselves under the ground, as well as them spreading seeds. They have these really cool little puffy seed heads that will start to come in after the flowers fade. And yeah, I love that kind of keeping their options open thing. Even if there's not as many bees around that year, they'll find a way to spread. But it takes 5 to 7 years to grow from a seed to a bulb and flower. So they're kind of, I think that's part of this ancient thing. If you have a big carpet of them, it's taken them a number of years to reach that point. And they're gorgeous because if you have them in your garden, then they will spread. Once they have their safe haven, they'll start to take up the space, which is really beautiful. So, as I was mentioning, in English folklore, there are all kinds of connections between bluebells and fairies, and I just wanted to share some of those. So, bluebell woods were thought to be enchanted by the fairies, and they are thought to be places where this veil between their world and our world is thinner, which is really interesting in connection to Beltane, because that's one of the beliefs about Beltane on May Day, is this thinning of the veil, and the idea that it's easier for humans to visit the fairy realm around May Day, which is when the bluebells come out. So I just think that's really perfect. And perhaps linking to a bit of that sort of, what story am I thinking of? It's Little Red Riding Hood. Along with those kind of stories that we have about woodlands being places that are somewhat risky, and they would have been in some ways, either where there's predators or being more likely to be in danger from other people because they can sort of get lost in the trees and things. Bluebell woods are thought to be prime spots for people to be spirited away by the fairies. And maybe they were, of course, and or maybe that's part of, our cultural thing around, be careful in the woods. The wild woods can be dangerous places and magical places and exciting places, and that sort of relationship that we have with danger and risk. So one of the other things that I really love about the folklore is it mirrors the legal protection that the bluebells now have. So it was said that picking a bluebell would curse you to be led astray by the fairies, especially if you were a human child. Fairies do love to whisk children away. And that if you trampled a patch of bluebells, that would bring you bad luck from the fairies. Which is just interesting and awesome, isn't it? It's like the fairies knew and our ancestors knew that bluebells were precious and that they shouldn't be picked or sampled on. And we've now got this legal that's written in law now. It's really interesting. One wearing a necklace of bluebells is meant to prevent you from being able to lie, and the bluebells would ring. They would actually be little bells, which I just is such a beautiful image of them actually chiming. And that would be calling the fairies to gather. But if a human heard it, it would mean that that person was going to die quite soon. And I'm not sure if that was because they were cursed if they heard it, or if it's about that thinning of the veil thing. If you were able to hear the bells, then maybe you were already closer to dying than you realised. And it was just actually that you were able to hear it. I'm not quite sure which way round that myth goes. If you can turn a bluebell flower inside out without tearing it, it means that you'll win your one true love. And in the language of flowers, the bluebell stands for humility, gratitude, and everlasting love, which is really beautiful. And it's interesting that they have this kind of slightly darker side, and then some of these really beautiful associations as well. So I think one of the reasons that there's possibly this darker side is that they are really toxic. So all of the parts of the plant contain toxins. But we're also finding that those might be useful in treating things like cancer and HIV. They have very sticky sap, and that had some interesting historic uses, including bookbinding, sticking feathers onto arrows in the Bronze Age, and stiffening Elizabethan collars. So you know, the kind of the Queen Elizabeth ruff. They made a sort of starch out of bluebells for that. So they have been around for a really long time. They are... One of the things I love at the moment is if you go and enjoy a walk in the Bluebell Wood, there will be a lot of people also doing the same thing, because they are such a spectacular sight and so precious to us. And that's really why I wanted to share them. I couldn't sort of not mention them at some point in this course. So those are the kind of the facts and the essential bits. There's also a little bit of mythology, extra stuff that I want to share with you as well. So I'll come back with that in a sec. So I wanted to share with you a couple of Greek mythology. I wanted to share with you a couple of Greek mythological associations with bluebells. So their scientific name has changed since the 1970s, and it originally had the name of, I'm just going to work on my pronunciation, Endymion. I think that's right. And now Endymion was a mortal in Greek mythology who was very beautiful, and the goddess of the moon, Selene, fell in love with him. And there are some variations in the myth around whether he chose to go into an immortal sleep to preserve his beauty forever, or whether he was cursed to do that, or whether Selene herself cast this spell on him. But either way, whatever happened, he was cast into an eternal sleep in a cave, and so that he would never grow old and die for whatever reason. And Selene would go and visit him in a cave on Mount Latmus. And this was one of the explanations for the phases of the moon, that she would be going away to go and visit Endymion and then coming back again, which is really beautiful. And she bore him 50 daughters, which is a lot, isn't it? So that was originally part of the scientific name of bluebell. And one of the possibly slightly risky herbal uses of bluebells was believed to be in stopping nightmares. So it's possible that this sort of like sleepy vibe was why they had that woven into their name. And then when they changed their scientific classification, they changed it to be hyacinth. Just going to check my notes to make sure it's, again, my pronunciation. So they were put in as like a kind of like part of, or like a cousin of, the hyacinth family. And they do look quite similar. to those flowers. And hyacinths are linked to the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus, which actually is a similar story to Endymion. So again, you've got a beautiful mortal, this time Hyacinthus, who was fallen in love with by a god, Apollo. And Apollo was the son of Zeus. But he wasn't the only person who fell in love with this beautiful mortal. And there are various different versions of the story, that some of them it was a kind of like an accident, and some it was more of like a jealous thing. But whilst playing discus, Endymion was injured in the head and died, and Apollo was absolutely devastated. And where the blood fell from his head onto the ground, it wrote on the petals of a flower, "Alas, alas." And so Bluebell's name is actually means the hyacinth that isn't written on. So it's not the flower that rose from the ground with "Alas, alas" written on it, but it sort of could be related to it. No one's exactly sure what flower that would have been in ancient Greece, that they would have had that story about. But what's interesting is Hyacinthus possibly predated this story of Apollo. There was a cult associated with him, and months and festivals. So it's possible that he was an older god who was a similar sort of style of celebration to Persephone, who we were talking about last month, and to Adonis, where they would have worshipped and celebrated the bringing back of plant life in spring. So he had associations with this beautiful time of year when the greenery and the flowers return. So yeah, it's interesting that there have been these two myths just gently woven into the background name. We never really talk, do we, in scientific names of plants. We mostly use their common names and what we know them as locally and things like that. But woven into the background, I just think that's really lovely. There are these two interesting myths to do with the moon and spring and nature and love, and that sort of interesting, challenging love between a god and a mortal, and how the gods honour and celebrate and try and preserve the mortals who they love, which is just really magical. So when we're tuning into Bluebell and leaning in to learn from her at this time of year and set some intentions, there are so many little threads that you could choose from. It could be fairy related, it could be to do with sleep, it could be to do with the idea of protection and safe havens and beautiful spaces. It could be in how you can tune in another level deeper to the changing seasons and celebrate the returning of plant life and animal life all around you every year. There will be a guided meditation for tuning in a bit more deeply, and there's loads of ideas in the pack as well. These flowers have a very beautiful, light, watery, airy energy. Walking in a bluebell wood feels a bit like swimming sometimes. There's something, it's like you're swimming through cool air with patches of warmer bits, and there's this beautiful scent. So yeah, they're just magical and really special to tune into. And there's some YouTube videos with them in if you don't have them nearby, or if you've never had the amazing opportunity to go and walk in some bluebells. And then of course there's all sorts of other things online and books and fairy tales to choose from to help you tune in and see what message Bluebell has particularly for you at this time of year. And then we're going to move on to our next guide. The second guide we're going to be working with this moon is the beautiful roe deer. We only have a few species of deer in the UK, and roe deer are on the larger side, but they're still quite small in the scale of like deer all over the world. They're a kind of medium to small sized deer. They measure up to about 75 centimetres at the shoulder, 60 to 75 centimetres. There's not that much difference visibly between male and females. Males at around 2 years will have antlers, but they're quite, let's see if I can do it. They're not the full this, they're more kind of like this. They're quite spiky and stumpy. And sometimes females have them as well. And over the 2 years, the males will get little buttons and stumps as they grow their antlers. They don't have a particularly visible tail, but they do have like a big creamy white flash on their butt, on their rump, and it's one of the signals that they use as like an alarm thing. So quite often if you see a deer and it's springing away from you and it has a big white bottom, then you know it's a roe deer. They can run really fast and they have a boing. They do a beautiful like jumpy boing to run away. Their coats are kind of grey-brown in winter and they turn to a more gingery red in summer. And their fawns have white spots, which help them to camouflage in the dappled sunlight in woodland and grassland. So roe deer are found across Europe, apart from Ireland. They've got a really big range from the Mediterranean to Scandinavia and northern Iran and Iraq. They've been here since before the Neolithic, which is amazing. So again, we've got this kind of long history, this deep ancestral link with these animals that would have been around for our ancestors for a really long time. So they were close to extinction here in the 1800s, but reintroduction projects have been really successful. And I guess one of the reasons for that is we don't really have predators left for them. Red foxes might prey on fawns, and then we are their other main threat, both from hunting deliberately and through vehicle collisions and accidents and things like that. And I guess there's this interesting aspect coming in here that came in a bit as well if you were part of the hibernation when we were working with bear. We used to have bears and wolves and lynxes and all sorts of, bigger predatory animals here, but we don't anymore. So when you have a herbivore like a deer, there is some debate around how you then stop them just eating everything and kind of taking over. And it makes me think a bit about the wolf introduction that they've done in Yellowstone, and the impact that that's had on the elks and things like that. So there's this kind of like, they're beautiful and precious, but we are sort of missing some of the kind of the pyramid here in the UK with the kind of you've got the plants at the bottom, you've got the herbivores, and then there would be apex predators that we don't have anymore. But that being said, we are the main threat to them, and so therefore they are quite wary of us. It'll vary how close you'll be able to get to see them, depending on, how their relationship with humans has been in that area for them. But yeah, they're a really beautiful part of our landscape, and one of the main species that you're going to see in woods. They like mosaic habitats, which is one of my favourite phrases. So the idea that a habitat is made up of lots of little different bits. So maybe there'd be some woodland, some countryside, farmland, some hedgerows. They might even come into gardens sometimes, but they like a bit of a patchwork in their habitat, which I really like because I feel like we like that too. They like to eat buds, bark and leaves from trees and shrubs. They also might eat acorn, fungi, ferns, grasses, heather and cereal crops. So they really encourage us to think about our own habitat and our diet and that kind of combination, mosaic habitat, kind of a combination veggie diet, what are the things that you need in your habitat or your diet? What do you like to mix up? Yeah, and this is really beautiful as well. So thinking about this kind of munching, when you're a herbivore, you have to eat a lot of the time, don't you, to get your energy. And in Norse mythology, there were 4 stags that browsed, which means they kind of nibbled off of the world tree Yggdrasil. Apologies for my pronunciation, that's my best go. And they, within Norse mythology, there was this idea that the deer eat the buds, which were the hours, the blossom, which was the days, and the branches that were the seasons of the year. So there's this kind of like munching of time, which, isn't that just such a beautiful image? Similar to kind of like sand falling through an hourglass, you've got the deer munching away at time, and of course then it grows back. There will be more blossom and buds and branches. There's this kind of constant relationship of sort of wearing down and growing back. So there are seasonal shifts in how the roe deer live their lives. So adult male roe deer will there are seasonal shifts in how the roe deer live their lives. So in summer, adult males will quite often be quite solitary, and then they'll come together with family groups over winter. And females and the young deer will stay together in family groups for most of the year. And the size of the group will depend on what food is available, what habitat they're in. But I know there's a herd of deer that we see near us that's quite big, and they've got a big woodland to roam through and some farmland nearby. But the size of that herd is going to vary a bit seasonally. They go into rutting season, which is in the heat of July and August. Now this is the time when there can be fighting and big displays, and this is where those little antlers come in handy for the males. It can be quite a feisty, fiery time. But even if the female deer become pregnant at that time, they've got the ability to delay implantation, which is something quite a lot of animals have. And it means that rather than the baby deer being born in the middle of winter, when it would be bleak and cold and not much food around, the babies are then born in spring. So around this time of year, around May or June. And there are these beautiful little fawns with white spots on, and the mothers will leave them for quite long periods of time and then come back and feed them. So we've got to be really careful at this time of year around not disturbing fawns if you find them, making sure not to touch them because they are very smell oriented beings, and if a baby deer smells of a human, then its mother is gonna freak out because their bond is very scent related. And I just love this idea that they're a creature that's so in tune with the seasons, and they change their behavior based on what's going on temperature wise and what's available plant wise. And they're a great role model for this year of Wild Wisdom, this course that I'm running about tuning into the seasons and reminding us to notice where we might feel we want to be more solitary or when we want to be closer to our family and friends. Interestingly, for me, I think my pattern kind of works that maybe this is one of the reasons that I needed this to create this course. My pattern works kind of the other way around to how culturally we're supposed to work. So Christmas is meant to be a time of getting together with your family and things, but I really want to hibernate and I really want to do people in winter. In spring and summer, I'm much more outgoing and I want to see people. So the deer invites us, I think, to consider our cycles and within the year, within the month, even within the day, of how we're feeling about other people, what we want to eat, where we want to be. And that's just such a useful little question from them. They also have something really amazing. So with these really cool little antlers, they grow over those 2 years into bigger antlers that they will have in November. They will start to grow in November. And in spring, they're covered in a layer of velvet, which they will rub off so that they then have, by the rutting season, the male's antlers will be kind of fully out and a little bit sort of shiny. And then they shed them after they mate in October. So it's really interesting to think of the energy that would have gone into producing this really beautiful pair of antlers. And then they just fall off and they let them go. And then they grow a new pair the next year. And when we look at the sort of folk tales and ancestral stories and stuff around deer, that feels like an important part of it. And they're not the only deer species to do this. And it also means that you will find antlers in the forests without having to hurt or hunt a deer. There'll just be antlers lying around, or they've been shedding them. And what a beautiful example of letting go and renewing and rebirthing something every year with the seasons. So deer would have had in our culture connections to fertility and rebirth and rejuvenation, and their antlers feel like a very important part of that. And I've touched on this a little bit before. I'm going to sort of touch on it from a slightly different angle. So with like the rutting season, I wanted to talk a bit about how deer embody power and also gentleness. And again, that feels like maybe why they've been an important part of kind of folklore and symbolism for different cultures that have deer living nearby, is that they kind of embody both. They embody fighting and they're a prey animal. They're a gentle herbivore. So there would have been, they are wary of us. They're a lot of the time very watchful. I'm doing that, their ears. The ears are always listening. They have these big, beautiful eyes. So we're saying scent is incredibly important to them. They are constantly in tune with their environment, taking in everything. And in rutting season, that energy changes to being more aggressive, more fighty and feisty. So yeah, that feels like a bit important part of deer's world, really, is that interesting balance between those two ways of being in the world. And of course, they would have been important to our ancestors because they ate them, they used their skins, they would have used their antlers for things. So they were kind of physically precious as a resource. I don't really like to think of animals that way, but there were kind of like a materiality to them that would have been precious to our ancestors. But that symbolism as well, that balance between being powerful and being gentle, is just really, really magical. I wanted to touch a bit more deeply on some of the more ancient mythology and symbolism of deer. So as far and wide as the range of different types of deer and reindeer too, as far and wide as these animals are found, there is the most amazing iconography from different cultures. And deer and reindeer were and continue to be sacred and important creatures to the human cultures around them. And I just wanted to touch on some of the archaeology because it's so exciting. So I wanted to share with you a bit about the Ice Maiden, who you might have heard of. So she was found in the Siberian permafrost. So I don't think she was necessarily deliberately mummified, but the way the permafrost worked, she was preserved from the Iron Age. And she was found in the 1990s. And no one knows who she was, but all we can do is kind of look at how she was buried to see that she was obviously someone very important. Her burial style greatly honours and celebrates her. She was buried with 6 horses, food, herbs, and loads of other regalia. And her dress was incredible. The bits that were preserved, she has this amazing headdress and really cool boots. So she was quite small, I think. She's only 25. And small by kind of like our standards, but she would have stood a lot taller. She would have been riding a horse with a lot of, tall headdress and things. And there's lots of speculation about what all of the things she was buried with might symbolize and say about her. One of my favorite things about her is that they could see the tattoos on her skin still. And she's got the most beautiful swirling tattoos. She has a deer with a griffin's beak on her shoulder and another deer with large antlers on her wrist. So deer and kind of mythological deer creatures were obviously very important to her and her culture. And so I think she was from, I'm not going to pronounce this right. She was a Pazark. Pazark? This is one of those ones where I haven't heard anyone say it out loud. Person who were related to the Scythian people, and a lot of their iconography has deer carrying the sun in their antlers across the sky. So again, there's this kind of the way this creature that would have been incredibly important to them, practically, it becomes recognised as the kind of sacred being that they are and woven into artwork and mythology in this really beautiful way. Another amazing piece of archaeology that has some gorgeous deer iconography on it is the Gundestrup cauldron. I was lucky enough to see this in an exhibition a few years ago, and it's big. It's probably bigger than that. It's like a big silver bowl that's got panels, illustrated panels around the sides and a big illustration in the bottom. And it's another Iron Age piece. It's found in Denmark. It's got both deer and a couple of human figures with deer antlers on as well. And there's lots of speculation about who those might be. One of the thoughts is that it's Cernunnos, who was a horned Celtic deity. He was associated with fertility and wild animals, and is also connected to the underworld. And there are other pictures of him both with antlers and with ram's horns. And deer and stags were some of his sacred animals. And another beautiful piece of archaeology, and if you have a look online you can find photos and video of all these things, and they're just so stunning. So at Sutton Hoo, which is a really famous archaeological find site here in the UK, they found a ship burial which they believe was an Anglo-Saxon king. And that's where they got the Sutton Hoo mask was probably the most famous thing, this beautiful golden mask. And within the other burial items was a scepter made of stone. So I think some thought maybe the stone might be a whetstone for sharpening against. And standing on the top of it is this beautiful stag. And it's believed that the king that's buried there was from this time when paganism in the UK would have been being overtaken by Christianity, and that he was a descendant of a family line that claimed to be descended from Odin. And it's just really interesting that this stag is in there with his burial items. Again, obviously being important in some way. Stags with those big antlers, symbols of rebirth and renewal. And the kind of like that sort of fighting, rutting, powerful energy would have been a really beautiful thing to have on a scepter. And then the last little bit I wanted to touch on was that in Celtic mythology, in Cornwall and Wales and Ireland, deer are fairy creatures who are thought to be able to move between the realms of humans and fairies. So again, kind of tying in with Beltane and bluebells, here you have an animal who was thought to be able to move freely between those two worlds. And I love that. That's just such a beautiful... No. So the last piece that I wanted to touch on in this mythology bit is in the Celtic mythology of Wales and Cornwall and Ireland, deer are seen as fairy creatures, and they'll be able to move between the fairy realm and the human realm freely. They don't need bluebells, they can just move in between. And that just feels like a really beautiful piece this month with Beltane and with the bluebells and their association with fairies. Deer have also got this fairy association as a creature who can just walk between the veils whenever they want to. And I'm sure that they would then be an important creature to the fairies as well when they got there. So yeah, we're working with this incredibly beautiful animal with these different energies. There's so much here that you could draw on for some intention setting this moon. And there'll be the meditation for you to tune in and really get a beautiful message from deer. And you might have already got some ideas as you're listening. There's a lot in here, isn't there? And both of these guides just feel very special and magical. One little extra piece that I wanted to add in for this final month of Unfurl is a personal folklore challenge. This is inspired by both of the guides and their like deep connections to folklore, but it's particularly related to bluebells and that way that their current legal protection mirrors their fairy protection. So I was thinking about how beautiful that is. And so this could be just an exercise that you do for fun, and it could also be quite useful in your intention setting as well. And the idea of the folklore challenge is to create some folklore about yourself that celebrates your weirdness, your uniqueness, and some of your boundaries and needs in the way that the fairy folklore does for Bluebell. So for Bluebell, this piece around if you trample a patch of bluebells, the fairies will curse you with bad luck, connects to the fact that if a bluebell is trampled, it can't photosynthesize and it will die. So the invitation is to think of some of your own mythology and folklores connected to your needs. And in the pack and online, you might have seen me share my examples. So one of my things, one of the things I really struggled with is unexpected phone calls. So I have a few people that I can cope with this from if it's an emergency and things like that. I don't want it to sound like I will never answer the phone to anyone ever. But I'm a massive introvert and I find talking on the phone quite challenging. And so I could create some folklore around that. It could be that if you phone Sam the Witch Fairy uninvited, I think maybe the ravens might come and steal your phones. I've heard that can happen. Or that your phone might just disappear from your hand. Or magically just stop working. Worse, a worse transgression than an uninvited phone call is an uninvited turning up on my doorstep. Again, you know, there are exceptions to this rule, but as a general thing, it's something that I find quite tricky. And our house is quite chaotic and our garden is quite wild and there's a lot of brambles and ivy. So I think, you know, I would be worried if I was going to ring on this house's door without first texting a few days in advance to check that that was going to be okay. I would be worried that that maybe those ivy and bramble plants, you know, they could be quite tangly and you might not come out of them. So the invitation is to play with that a little bit and think about your needs and boundaries and what the fairies might do to somebody who crosses them. I'm going to finish the video with a couple of invitations for your next steps. As ever, the invitation is to take some time in the build up at some point from the new moon to the full moon, working with that lovely waxing moon energy to set some intentions, to claim something, to let something go, and take some inspiration from our absolutely magical and beautiful guides. Have a look through the pack. There'll be the meditation to tune into to really get some lovely solid ideas and messages around what's needed for you at this time of year, what's going to serve you the most as we go through this beautiful moon that's going to lead us into June. We're sort of heading into that transition between spring and summer as the bluebells fade and the tree canopy takes over. We're stepping into that much more summery vibe. Things are just going to continue to get like more and more abundant and busy in nature. How are you feeling and what's going to serve you? And then at the end of the pack for this moon as well, because this is our final moon of Unfurl, there's space to come back at the end of the moon and do some reflection and gratitude practice, noticing what you've learned or what's changed for you, and giving a little bit of gratitude to all of the guides that we've worked with. So there's some journaling space for that. And then there's also a page of some ideas of what you could do to give back a bit to the natural world at the end of Unfurl as well. So yeah, as always, come and say hi in the Facebook group. Enjoy it. Feel the magic. There's this time of year just has this sort of is getting this like more and more like bubbling magical intensity. And if you're not feeling that right now, that's okay. But part of your intention this moon could be really to tap into that a bit more deeply and max out. You know, we've got more daylight hours now. There's more time for magic, it feels to me. There's more, we just have that little bit more capacity, even on days when we might be feeling ill or rough or low. There's that little bit, there's that moreness going on right now. There's that slightly more abundant energy that's there for you to tap into. So yeah, have fun and set some intentions, maybe create some folklore, and just enjoy tuning in to Bluebell and Roe Deer.